Right, today I signed paperwork to allow me to adopt you.
That's bad.
Just today. That's the good news. The bad news is it might take anywhere between 1 and 6 weeks to actually get done. So I'm like, listen, we signed adoption papers today. We're going to get a date pretty soon, and we're going to be able to adopt you. And they're all like,
am I in trouble?
Am I not
in trouble? Was that the bad news?
Their response was
excited on the inside, but like on the outside, it was just a shock. It just out of nowhere sort of thing.
it's not registering with the kids, certainly not like us.
Hey friends, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It's Thursday, February 1st, 2024. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. I have seen so many comments on my channel of comments that Robyn Brown's mom, Alice, was a mistress and never lived really in the polygamous world. And so that's why Robyn never understood how to live polygamy. And I thought, well, this is a great topic for a video because this will actually explain to viewers a secret, a very dirty secret about the Apostolic United Brethren and why the way that Robyn grew up is not abnormal for members of the Apostolic United Brethren. It's not abnormal because Rulon Allred and the primary founder, he wasn't the founder, but he's who the AUB sort of looks to with a lot of reverence and as their prophet. The first Allred of the men to be the prophet of the AUB, he promoted an idea to the followers that they maintain membership within the LDS church, that they not disclose that they were polygamists, and that they have dual memberships to both the AUB and the LDS church. This was also ramped up in the early 1980s once the LDS church made the decision to allow people of color, specifically men, to hold priesthood and have rights to the temple. And as many people in the church flocked away from the church due to that change, they joined sects like the AUB. Membership in the AUB swelled, and it was members of the LDS church that flocked there. And those members, many of them, maintained joint membership in both the LDS and in the AUB. And that was how they were able to blend into society and make it harder for anyone to detect what they're doing, who they are, and what they're about. Some former members of the Apostolic United Brethren argue that because they blend in so well and because their system appears open when it's actually not, it's even harder for members to come forward and for anyone to take them seriously about what they experience inside the group. So let's dive into the topic of Reva Alice Fulmer, the mistress, or is she? Before we do, make sure to give this video a thumb. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed, and click on the bell so you never miss a video. All right, so one of the most common comments I've been seeing in the last several months is that because Christine Brown on the show said that Robyn Brown did not ever live polygamy, people are assuming that Robyn Brown didn't have experience growing up in polygamy, and so she meant like Robyn's never lived polygamy ever. Now, it's kind of a stereotype that all polygamists live in compounds and they only associate with one another, and that all polygamous men have their wives in one home. While this does happen, there are so many former members that I've spoken to including the prophet's daughter, Dave Watson's daughter, Emily Lee, who told me about how when she grew up, none of his wives all lived together. They all lived in separate homes. And so while some of the siblings were close, a lot of the time, and with some of the siblings, they're more like cousins than they are like sisters and brothers. And Cody and Janelle and Christine and all of them said that they didn't want to have that experience. They didn't want their kids to grow up as cousins. They ended up growing up as cousins once they got older because they all started to live separately. One way that men in polygamy specifically will try to get around the law is to have their wives potentially live in separate states, separate cities, and separate places so no one can detect who they are. No one will have any idea that what they're doing is against the church rules, because if the church finds out that the member is polygamous, they get excommunicated. So some members, specifically in the AUB, take very drastic steps to conceal their identities and to conceal their double life. So they have a public life that's very public, and they have a wife that's their legal wife that will go out and about with them, and then they have another wife that no one knows exists. If you want to see how this sort of plays out in a fictitious way, the first season of Big Love really talks a lot about, what the legal wife has compared to the other wives, and how they can't claim their husband publicly. Their children can't be claimed by the husband publicly. When the kids see the dad out in the public, they have to pretend like that's not their dad. He has to pretend like that's not their kids. That would be an example of what it's like to be a public person that has public face, and you can't let people know that you're a polygamist. So Mary, before they were married and before they all moved to Utah, they didn't all live together. Christine, for a while, lived in her own house. Janelle lived in her own house, and Mary lived in her own house. They did live together in one house for a while. They've split up. They've done all kinds of models. And then their last time they lived together was in Lehigh. But even in Lehigh, even though they were all living in one house, Cody could not go out into the public and claim the other wives. So prior to the show being on air, when Cody was out publicly, his only wife was Mary. He didn't acknowledge Christina as his wife. He didn't acknowledge Janelle as his wife. He didn't acknowledge those kids as his children. This is how the hierarchy of kids ends up, where kids that are not being able to be accepted result in feeling like they're not seen by their parents. They're not valued by their father. They can feel jealousy and envy and anger towards those that can claim dad publicly. And Robyn's situation growing up would have been a lot like Christine's kids. So let's kind of dive into the sort of the lore of Alice. Alice Fulmer is actually Reva Alice Fulmer. And she was actually married to Robyn's biological dad, Robert, and they lived in Pinesdale, Montana. There's been some speculation that Reva only joined the AUB once she met Paul Sullivan, the second husband of hers, but that's actually false. Her first husband and her actually converted to the AUB together, and Robyn grew up in Pinesdale with her father and her mother until her parents divorced. And I believe her parents divorced when she was like 9 or 10. I think their divorce records are from 1989, so she would have been 11. So Robyn was like 11 when her parents divorced. So she grew up with a father and a mother, and her dad actually had 2 wives. Reva was the legal wife, and then he had a second wife that wasn't the legal wife. When Reva and him got divorced, he actually married the second wife legally. And I believe he still is married to her to this day. And Robyn has siblings from her other mom up in Pinesdale that was married biologically to her dad that she's friends with and follows on her social media. She did grow up in polygamy, and if you are familiar with Pinesdale was acquired back around 1960 by the AUB It was going to be the new place, the promised land where everyone would go when the end of the world came. It was going to be the United Order and where they would build their compound or one of their compounds. And it was, sort of a vision of Rulon Allred when this was purchased. So that's a polygamous community. And they have a school, they have churches. It's an insular community, and it's not a huge town, but that would be considered a polygamous community. And so she did grow up in a polygamous community. When her mom left her dad and moved to Utah, they moved to St. George. And there is a group in the AUB in St. George. And so Robyn attended public school in St. George. She graduated from Dixie High School in St. George in 1997. And her mom became the second wife of Paul Howard Sullivan. Paul's first wife was actually around the same age as him. Paul was 17 years older than Alice when he took her as a second wife. So she was the younger wife, and she went on to have multiple kids with him. But Paul Howard Sullivan, who also was a convert to this church, maintained dual membership in both the Latter-day Saints Church, so the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he was also a member of the AUB. And because Paul also not only had dual membership in both churches, he was also a city employee in both Las Vegas, and he worked for the state of Utah for a while. And so for Paul, he actually had to hide his life even more because of his position in the government. And this is what a lot of polygamists do, is they hide their lives if they're in the government because they don't want anyone to know. And so for a while, Alice and her kids lived in St. George, and Paul and his wife lived in Las Vegas. But they're only about 2 hours apart. And this gave him the flexibility of not having the people that he worked with in Las Vegas know that he had a second family in St. George. That doesn't mean that that Robyn and her siblings didn't grow up in polygamy. In fact, that is a model of polygamy, where the man has separate homes in separate states. And because a lot of these states, like for instance, there's cities on the border of Short Creek in Arizona, there are men that have houses on both sides of the border. And so if they're going to get heat in Utah, they can go down to Arizona. If they're going to get heat in Arizona, they go up to Utah. And they have wives in different states. You'll see that in Pinesdale in Idaho. So some of the guys will have wives in Idaho and some in Pinesdale. You'll see that where some will have wives and live in Las Vegas and they have family in St. George. It's not uncommon. And that doesn't mean that she didn't grow up in polygamy. It just means that she didn't grow up in the stereotypical model of the one house where all the wives live together, which is a stereotype. And while there are communities in compounds with the AUB, and the AUB has compounds in Eagle Mountain, they have a compound in Rocky Ridge. In fact, Rocky Ridge, Utah is entirely operated by the Apostolic United Brethren. Every single member of that works for the city and that works in the water department and works in the government in Rocky Ridge is from the AUB. That entire city operates a lot like Short Creek did before they got broken up. So that's a compound. There's one in Mount Pleasant where there's a compound, and it's on the compounds that you will see the large houses that look a little bit strange, and they have multiple entrances and they're enormous, and inside those homes there might be 16 different areas and 4 different apartments for all the different wives. So yes, there are people in the AUB that live in one home, and a lot of them live in the communities that are where their compounds are. But if the members of the AUB are more integrated into the society, which a lot of them are, and they're just sort of undercover polygamists, they exist sort of like Paul. And that's why the AUB is dangerous, because they are blending into the mainstream church and they're infiltrating into the mainstream church, and they're actually recruiting directly from the mainstream church. I can tell you with a fact that there is currently a member of the AUB that is a leader, and I'm not going to say in what capacity, but he sings in the tabernacle of the LDS, and he hosts music, piano concerts within the LDS, and he teaches music lessons in the LDS. He's a joint member, and he is operating in plain sight, but he's hiding. The AUB believes that right now the AUB and the LDS Church are separated, but they will eventually come back together. And so because of that, they still hold regard for the rules and the leadership of the mainstream church, but they believe that they've become misguided, and eventually they will realize that they were wrong in their key holders of who the leaders are and who the prophets are, and they'll realize that the AUB was actually the right line of key holders through Joseph Smith, and they'll mesh back together. And so because of that belief, they don't completely abandon away from the LDS church, and so a lot of them remain members. And so they can go into churches, and then they can recruit wives, they can recruit people. I've talked to many women who were approached by people, and that's how they ended up in polygamy, because they met a man and they didn't know that he came from that church, but he was in their ward, and they ended up marrying him. And it was after the fact that they kind of realized, oh my God, he's in the AUB. So it's not that Reva was a mistress. It was that Reva's husband, or Alice's husband, was the undercover AUB, the dangerous kind of AUB, because they look normal, they act normal, but there's nothing normal about their lives. And they're hiding, and they're defrauding, and they're not only defrauding people in the public, but then the kids that they have, that they're raising, they don't acknowledge. And so I'm guessing some of Robyn's severe, what I believe is insecurity, come from the fact that she was never allowed to be claimed as a child and never got the attention, or never got to be a daughter in public with her stepdad, and that they likely felt like they were getting scraps compared to the main wife. So if legal wife is what he has to do most of the time, second wife isn't going to get as much time. They're not going to celebrate the holidays at the same time. They're not going to celebrate holidays together. They're not going to come together and do anything as a family. And that's how Robyn grew up. But for anyone to say that that's not polygamy, you just have a stereotypical understanding of what polygamy is. Robyn didn't grow up with the ideal that Cody wanted. Cody wanted all of them to live in one house. Christine didn't even live in one house until the very end. And once his Rex had the wives living in one house, the family blew up. And that's when Annie left. And Mary's father had multiple houses. And as far as I know, didn't have all of them living in one house, because Mary's dad had 5 wives. So it's just not, it's an unfortunate part of the culture. And because of the culture being the way that it is, every family has a different story. Every family has a different experience, but they all hide and they all pretend and they all are blending in. The AUB just blends in more than the other groups because some of their members don't isolate on the compounds and they live in the mainstream communities. So when Paul died, his obituary said that the funeral was going to be at the LDS church, which most polygamists, if they're excommunicated, don't have their funerals at the LDS church because they can't. When Owen Allred died, he was buried in Rocky Ridge. And when Bonnie Barber died, Mary's mom, she was buried in Rocky Ridge, which is the town I was telling you about that is completely made up of polygamists. Robyn's dad his funeral was at an LDS church. So it's clear that he maintained joint membership, and that joint membership likely enabled him to not be open. And that was a huge problem when Robyn went public because half her family was very private and they were hiding and they didn't want anyone to know that they were polygamists. And that's the reality. So when we think of Robyn's sort of maladaptive behaviors of being manipulative and cunning and using people and wanting to have nice things, being a shopping addict, wanting wealth and fame, wanting to be number one, wanting to be seen, wanting to be the most important, that is a learned behavior because she watched her mom not get number one. She watched her mom get scraps. She didn't live in affluence. She didn't get the benefits of what legal children get. And because her mom separated her from her dad in Montana, she didn't grow up being claimed by a dad. And I'm assuming that had she stayed in Montana, she would have had a father that likely loved her and wanted to be in her life. And I believe in many ways she's repeating a lot of the same steps her mom took by divorcing first husband, alienating first husband from kids, having new dad take in the kids as though he's dad, erasing dad from child's life. And it's a cycle. And she's repeating it with her kids. So it's probable that a lot of the same maladaptive behaviors she has are being transferred onto her children. And a lot of people have said that her daughters act very similar to her. Like they're manipulative with their tears, and they are competitive, and they are jealous, and they're not super kind to people. That's all a product of the upbringing, because the kids that aren't acknowledged, or dad only comes around to impregnate mom, they live in poverty, and dad, when he is around, he's just there to knock mom up, and a lot of these dads are abusive. And so these women that say they love their dads, they don't know what dads are outside of this system. They don't know that it's not normal to be treated the way that they've been treated. They don't know that it's not normal for dads to be not abusive. That's just how this culture works. So it sets the women up to end up in abusive relationships. And it also sets a lot of the women up to become narcissists because they're all so obsessed with becoming the best, and they want to be seen so much more than everyone else. And if you look at Robyn's history, she also grew up in a school where she wasn't the homecoming queen. She wasn't popular. She was in the German club, and she was in the drama club, and she was just sort of your average vanilla looking girl. So she clearly wanted to prove herself, and that's where you get to today. So Robyn does know what it's like to be polygamy and live in polygamy, and Robyn's behavior, I argue, is exactly a product of what happens in polygamy. And the behavior of her and her abusive tactics are seen in many women in this culture. So Robyn's mom was not a mistress. Robyn grew up in the reality of what polygamy is, not the fantasy of what the Browns pretended polygamy was on television. Tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye, guys.